Well, hello, everyone. Thank you to today's FAFSA Friday. This is our fourth FAFSA Friday. We started in September and we've been doing them on a monthly basis. So we would love to think that maybe we will continue these in the future. It will all be contingent on what happens with the FAFSA, but this is our last scheduled one. I'm Mila Tappan. I'm Manager of College Access and Outreach at FAME. And again, I am thrilled that you are here with us today. So what the goal is for today is we are going to cover some recent updates from federal student aid. We're going to talk about what needs to happen for students and families to get ready. We are then going to talk about some FAFSA formula changes that we haven't touched on yet in our FAFSA Friday sessions. Then we're going to do some Q&A. So I have some prepared Q&As, but also if you have Q&As or questions that you'd like to have answers to, we'll work on those and talk about those as well. And we're going to wrap up with a Kahoot. So for those of you who might have been attending other sessions, either our Wednesday webinars or our FAFSA Fridays, you are going to find that a little bit of this is going to be overlap from prior sessions. We hope that's okay. I think there are so many changes taking place that hearing things repeatedly can be really helpful. I know I've attended, I think, 4 or 5 NAS NCAN sessions for that exact reason. But I do want you to know if some of this does seem a little bit repetitive, hold tight, because when we get to the questions and answers specifically, that is going to be brand new content for the most part, things that we haven't talked about in some of our prior sessions. So hold tight with me while we go through some of the stuff that might be a little bit more repetitive, and then we'll get to that new stuff. I did want to do a quick poll because I am curious how many of you were at this week's Wednesday webinar. That will help me know who's heard this very recently and who might have not been there and not heard this. So I'm going to launch this poll. And so if you could go ahead and let me know if you attended the Wednesday webinar this week. And thank you, Tracy, for the question. Okay, let's see. So it looks like,
Mila, I'm sorry, can I just interrupt real quick?
yeah.
We do have one hand raised. I didn't know if you happened to see that.
Yes, I did.
Okay,
I'm
thank you.
trying to check a couple things real quick. So just bear with me, okay?
Thank you.
So first of all, it's covering up right now because I'm looking at the poll and it looks like 69% of you did not attend Wednesday's webinar and about 31% of you did. So given that, that makes me feel like, okay, I'll let you see the results. That makes me feel better because then I won't feel like I'm just simply repeating what was said the other day. I think the raised hand has gone down now. So if someone does have a question, just go ahead and put it in the chat and I will check in on that in a moment. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So I wanted to start by talking about some updates from federal student aid. These updates we came out on November 15th. So on November 15th, federal student aid released an announcement that had a couple of interesting pieces to it. The first was that students and families will be able to complete and submit the FAFSA online by December 31st. That was not shocking to us because by law, they were required to have it released before January 1st. So that was not a great shock. I guess it was helpful to hear it confirmed, though, that they were still on track to do that. What we also learned that I do think was surprising is that schools will begin receiving eligibility information, specifically what's referred to as an ISER, an Institutional Student Information Record, by the end of January. So that was surprising because what normally happens is when a FAFSA gets submitted, it gets processed very quickly within 2 to 3 days, depending on how busy the system is. And then that information is immediately available to the schools to pull in that data and to load it into their systems. So what no one expected, from what I'm understanding, was that they are going to let the FAFSA, they're going to open it up, people will be able to file the FAFSA, but they're not going to actually start processing records immediately. There will be a delay in the processing of records, and there'll therefore be a delay in the receipt of those records by schools. So what that does mean is that families will go ahead and file their FAFSAs in some cases. And then what they're going to find is if they call the school, in the middle of January and said, "Do you have my FAFSA?" The schools are going to say, "No, we don't have anybody's FAFSA." So obviously that is going to create also a delay in those records getting loaded to their systems, getting tested. There's a brand new formula this year that they're going to try to figure out how to then award financial aid dollars. So there's no doubt this year is going to require additional patience beyond what we've already experienced. And I think that we will probably not see financial aid offers coming out. I can't imagine any schools are going to get them out any earlier than mid-February. And depending on the school's specific situation, it could even be a little bit later. But I do think that what does make sense is to keep sharing with people that we're all in this together, right? That no one school has an advantage over another, really. Everyone is experiencing the same delay. So we're just going to be patient. We're going to just work through this together and try to support each other through this rollout of a new FAFSA. Now, this is one of the questions I actually got in the chat that you might have seen, which is that we are recommending that people wait a week to 10 days to file the FAFSA once it's been released. And I know that people are saying, well, why would you recommend that we wait? We're always like, get your FAFSA filed as soon as possible. So it might seem like it's conflicting. I will say, even in a year where the FAFSA has not changed, I never recommend that people file the FAFSA on October 1st when it's available then. I think the first day, if there are going to be any bugs, especially given that we have a brand new form, they're on a brand new platform, I think there are going to be a few hiccups. If there aren't, that's great. If we find that what we're hearing is that everything is working perfectly, hey, we'll go put something on our website. We'll send out that message that, you know what, we thought maybe it was a good idea to wait, but we really do want you to just go ahead and file now. But I think what could happen, and has happened in the last couple of years, is that it's just a little clunky those first couple of days. People might find that it's just slower or they can't move along the way that they want to. We're just not sure. And given that they're not ready to process information, makes us concerned that there might be some pieces that are just not quite ready to go. What we don't want to have is have people have a bad experience. We don't want people to file that first day or those first couple of days when everything isn't running smoothly. So that is part of why we're saying, wait a little bit before you file the FAFSA. The other reason is that schools, like I just mentioned, are not even going to start getting records until the end of January. So we really feel like if people wait a week or so to file, let everything get kind of worked out. And then what will happen is that everyone who files, before they start sending out records, the school's going to get them all at the same time anyway. So that's our rationale. There might be people who just say, hey, that's okay. I'm going to take my chances and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to file as soon as it's available. And that's okay. I think as a broader message, we just want people to have a good experience, and we are feeling like they'll have a better experience if they wait just a little bit to see how the system is working. Okay. So additionally, in addition to the fact that FAFSAs are not going to be sent to the schools, those ICERs are not going to be sent to the schools until the end of January, students are also not going to be able to make corrections and updates. So let's just say, for example, a student files their FAFSA. They realize they wish they had added a particular school that they forgot to add. Normally, within 2 or 3 days, they could have gone back into their FAFSA. It would have been processed, and they could have made that addition to their FAFSA. They could have corrected anything, or they could have updated the schools on their FAFSA. This year, not going to work quite that way. What's going to happen is, again, once the FAFSAs are processed, sent to the school, they'll then be available to the student to make any updates and corrections. So the timing for that is also the end of January. Now, I do want to say that I got this question the other day, and I heard this question asked initially as well. Once they get caught up, so once they start processing FAFSAs and they get them all sent to the schools, then we will return to the regular time frame of FAFSAs being processed within 2 to 3 days and being available to the schools at that point in time. So this is just, a short window in time that's just unique to this year, like many things are this year. Institutions will be able to start making corrections in the following weeks. So as the ISA records or the FAFSA records come in, schools will be able to take a look at them, request any information that's needed, and they will then be able to go ahead and, make corrections if they've collected information or the student reaches out to them and there are some additional edits that need to be made to the FAFSA. That's when schools will start being able to do that. Now, when students file the FAFSA, they are going to get a confirmation page when they submit their FAFSA, and they will also get a confirmation email. This email will go to the students, not the parents, though. And what's going to happen is the students will get a notification that they have filed the FAFSA, that it's confirmed that the FAFSA has been received. It will give them their student aid index or their SAI. So that's the renamed EFC, okay, expected family contribution. So as soon as they submit their FAFSA, they will see their estimated SAI. So that's a really, really good thing. Additionally, if they're eligible for a federal Pell Grant, they're going to see that estimate as well on that confirmation page, and it will be noted in the email that is sent to them. The reason I wanted to bring this up is because that FAFSA submission summary, or what used to be called the Student Aid Report or their SAR, will not be available until February. So a lot of scholarship organizations, for example, the Worthington Foundation, wants to have a copy, has in the past wanted to have a copy of the Student Aid Report or the FAFSA submission summary now, so that they can see what the SAI is. Because of this delay in being able to see the FAFSA submission summary and to be able to get a copy of it to others, the Worthington Foundation has indicated that they will accept a copy of that submission confirmation email. So we're recommending that students hold on to that email, put it in a safe place. Don't delete it, even though everything looks fine. Keep it in a safe place in case they are applying for a scholarship and maybe that scholarship organization needs that information and maybe they will accept the email confirmation in place of the federal, the FAFSA submission summary until that becomes available. All right. Any questions about anything I've said so far? This is the section more than any that is going to be a repeat. If you've attended any of our sessions this fall, we've talked about what I'm going to talk about on the next couple of slides. But the reason we keep repeating these pieces is because this is so important. And these are where some of the most significant changes are for this year. So one of the things that we want students to be doing now, if they haven't already, is to identify their contributors. So let me define what a contributor is, because this is a new term on the 24-25 FAFSA. So a contributor is anyone who's providing information on the FAFSA who is also required to provide consent and approval. So consent and approval is something that is going to have to be provided by absolutely everybody in order for a student to be eligible for federal student aid. And basically what consent and approval is allowing for is for the Department of Education to send information from individuals to the IRS, for the IRS to pull tax records for those individuals, send them back to the Department of Education, and then redisclose federal tax information to schools and organizations like FAME. So what's going to be wonderful this year, I really do mean this, is that information is going to come directly from the IRS. That's great that we are no longer, as parents and students, intermediaries requesting that tax information be sent. This is just going to happen, but we have to provide our consent and approval in order for that to happen. So everyone who needs to provide consent and approval, again, is considered a contributor, and each of those contributors must have their own FSA ID. There is no way to get into a FAFSA any longer without having an FSA ID. Now, the student is always a contributor. Remember, the student is the applicant on the FAFSA, and so the student is always going to be a contributor. They need to provide consent and approval, even if they didn't file taxes. They always need to provide consent and approval and have their own FSA ID. There are other possible contributors depending on the student's situation. So they might have one parent who's a contributor. They might have two parents who are contributors, or a parent's spouse who is a contributor. Or if they are a student who is married, they may have their own spouse who is a contributor. I want to focus today specifically on dependent students and who their parent contributors might be, because we need them to identify who they are in their own individual situations so they can ensure that those parents have also gotten their FSA IDs ahead of time. So, if parents are married to each other, so if the student's biological or adoptive parents are married to each other, and we use those terms interchangeably, the parents are married to each other and filed a 22 joint tax return. 22 income, 2022 income is the year of income that is required on the 24-25 FAFSA. So if in that year those parents filed a joint tax return, then information for both parents is required on the FAFSA, but only one parent is going to need to have an FSA ID. Only one parent is technically going to be the contributor, or can be. And that is because if you are a married couple, you can provide consent and approval on behalf of your spouse. So if I'm filing a FAFSA and I'm providing consent and approval because I filed a joint tax return with my husband in 2022, I can grant consent and approval on his behalf. So he does not need to also go into the FAFSA and provide that consent and approval, okay? He certainly could get an FSA ID, but he doesn't have to. If parents are married and file 22 taxes separately, or if parents live together but aren't married, so aren't able to file a joint tax return, then information from both parents is going to be required, and both parents will have to have their own FSA ID in this situation, okay? They both will need their FSA ID. They're both going to need to sign into the FAFSA, and they're both going to need to provide consent and approval. Now, third scenario here is if parents are divorced, separated, or never married and don't live in the same household. The parent who provided the most financial support is going to be the parent on the FAFSA, and they will need their own FSA ID. So when it comes to the FAFSA, if we have a divorced situation, for example, both biological mom and dad will not be on the FAFSA. Instead, the student will identify which parent provided the most financial support. So say I'm the student, my mom provided 30% of my support, my dad provided 70% of my financial support. Dad is going to be my parent on the FAFSA. Dad is going to need an FSA ID. Mom is not on the FAFSA, doesn't need to worry about this part of the process at all. Another part to this question though, if dad is my parent on the FAFSA that I've identified, then I have to ask, is dad married as of today, the day the FAFSA is being filed? If dad is currently married on the day the FAFSA is filed, then dad's spouse's information is also required on the FAFSA. Whether or not the spouse needs their own FSA ID is dependent on whether or not they filed a joint tax return in 22. So if dad's spouse, say they've been married for several years, and in 2022 they filed a joint tax return, then only dad needs an FSA ID because he can provide consent and approval on behalf of both himself and his spouse. However, let's just say they got married over the summer. In that situation, they weren't able to file 22 taxes together. And then the spouse is going to need to have their own FSA ID as well. And both of them will have to go into the FAFSA, accessing it with their own FSA IDs and provide consent and approval. So everyone who doesn't have one, we want them to go create their FSA IDs now. We recommend creating an FSA ID at least a week before filing the FAFSA so that it can be authenticated with the Social Security Administration. We have recently learned, we knew people could start a FAFSA if it wasn't authenticated, but we have learned that people, can, if they go and get an FSA ID today, they can use it to not only access the FAFSA, but to complete and submit the FAFSA. But there is a downside to that. And I'm going to touch on that a little bit more in a moment. So we are still absolutely recommending that people get their FSA IDs ahead of time to allow time for them to be authenticated. To go get an FSA ID, to create an account, you go to studentaid.gov. You click on the Create Account button. Just keep in mind that individuals have to have a unique email address, so there can't be duplicate emails in the system. If family members share an email address and they have to create an FSA ID, each of them, they're going to need to create a new email account as well so that they all have their own unique email address. As we always mention, we don't want students to use their high school email address when creating an FSA ID account. And that's because they're going to lose access to that email over the summer, but they're going to have their FSA ID for years to come. And they want to have as many ways as possible to retrieve usernames and reset passwords if that is needed. And it almost always is. Ideally, we'd like to have people provide their mobile phone number when setting up FSA IDs. That's going to be beneficial as well. If people already have an FSA ID, so we've got contributors out there who already have one, because remember, once you have created an account, you have an account. People only have one, and it's tied to their social security number. But what we would like people to do who already have one is to try logging in and making sure that everything is working, making sure that they remember their username and password. If they don't remember their username and password, that usually is a little bit stressful. But now, if they're doing it early, they've got plenty of time, a little less stressful, to go in and retrieve their username and reset their password. You know, people can do that when they're ready to file the FAFSA as well. But I was doing a session the other day, and I had a student who had filed last year, and she couldn't remember any of her information. And I could see the stress in her, right? And I said to her, I said, aren't you glad you're doing this now? Because if you were having this experience, and she got it all resolved, but if you were having this experience at the time you were also trying to file the FAFSA, it just would have been a little bit tougher. So getting that, making sure those are all set ahead of time is really good. Additionally, it has been possible in the past to set up an FSA ID account without adding an email address and having it verified, but that is no longer the case. So even people who have an FSA ID, if they were one of those individuals who set up an account without an email address, the first thing they're going to have to do is add the email address and have that verified. So again, much better to get that done ahead of time. And always, if there's a need to update information, individuals can go under settings and they can update their email address, their phone number, their mailing address. Any of those things can be updated as needed, as people are going to have these accounts for a long time to come. This is where you go to set up an account. This is the current studentaid.gov site. So you can see where it says create account or log in. If you're on a phone and you want to give it a try, the little person is where you're going to click to get into the FSA ID segment of that website. All right, I have a mention in the chat here, so I'm just reading a quick question because it is relevant. The primary parent is determined by who provides the most support for the past 12-month period, right? That triggers that primary person to have their 2022 taxes pulled. It isn't who provided the most financial support in 2022, correct? Yes, it is who provided the most financial support in the last 12 months. That is correct. So thank you very much for that question. It's a great clarifying question. All right, so let's go on and talk about a few FAFSA formula changes. So one of the things that we're really, really excited about is that almost all of the income questions are going to come directly from the IRS. So the IRS is going to send that tax information that's being referred to as FTI, federal tax information. They're going to send it back to federal student aid so that it can be used to determine eligibility. Gone is the IRS data retrieval tool. So I mentioned a moment ago that we used to basically be an intermediary. So if I was filling out a FAFSA for my child and I wanted to use the IRS data retrieval tool, what I actually did is I logged in, I requested that the IRS send the information. And if they found it, which wasn't always the case, but when they found it, then it was up to me to share that back into the FAFSA. So I was the one, that's when I was providing consent to share it. Because it's the direct data exchange, the information is just going to come directly from the IRS. And that's again why we have to provide consent and approval. The information will not actually show up on the FAFSA. So don't be surprised that when you're doing these FAFSAs, you're not going to see any income information or any of the information that comes from the IRS. Again, any of that federal tax information, none of it's going to show in the FAFSA. It will be there, it will kind of live alongside the FAFSA and what's called the Federal Tax Information Module. So it will be there, it will be used to calculate eligibilities, but it will not be displayed on the FAFSA itself. Additionally, it will not be displayed on the FAFSA submission summary. So once we are able to have students access their FAFSA submission summary, and let's just say a scholarship organization wants a copy of it, the family doesn't need to worry about the fact that their income is going to show. Because if their income came through this direct data exchange, which it should for virtually everybody, then what's going to happen is it doesn't show up at all. The fields do not even exist going forward. Now, there are a few situations where there is going to be the requirement for manual entry of tax information, but it's going to only be in very limited situations. In these situations where individuals do have to enter their own tax information, they still have to provide consent and approval. Okay, so I just want to reiterate again, everybody must provide consent and approval even if they are not tax filers, even if they filed an extension, even if they file a foreign tax return, everybody has to provide consent and approval. So the untaxed income page is gone. So for any of you who have done, a bunch of FAFSAs through the years and, can kind of visualize the pages that you used to see, there was one where people would provide their untaxed income, and that page is completely gone. So basically, there is no longer the requirement that several types of income be listed on the FAFSA. One of the biggest ones, I think that's going to be an advantage or a real positive for families, who sometimes feel like as, maybe middle income families, that they don't get the benefit of the doubt sometimes when it comes to the formula. Everyone's going to find that people no longer have to include any money that they contribute to their retirement plan that is untaxed. So a lot of the time when we make a contribution to our retirement plan, that's pre-tax. And in the past, we had to put that information on the FAFSA, and that impacted financial aid eligibility. Now, because they're trying to simplify things, they're only using information, by and large, that's on the tax return. And so because pre-tax contributions to your retirement are not on your tax return, they will no longer factor into eligibility for students. So I think that's going to be a real positive for many, many families. Additionally, workers' comp is no longer going to have to be reported if it was untaxed, nor is cash support or other money paid on a student's behalf. So what was supposed to be happening, I'm not sure it always was, but students were supposed to list any income that they received from other people that helped with their support. So one of the big ones that we would run into is that grandparents might have had a 529 or someone else might have had a 529 for a student. And when the grandparents took a distribution and used it to help pay for school, in that tax year, those students were supposed to list that amount that they received. And so that just always, we had to talk about, okay, so when should grandparents take a distribution from a 529 plan, or what happens when other people outside want to help a student pay for their higher education? The good news is now that question is gone. So it is not going to show up at all. So if other people like grandparents or other family members are helping a student pay for college, that is not going to be listed on the FAFSA and therefore not going to have any impact on the student's financial aid eligibility. Okay. So now let's talk about a change that I know is not a popular one. So the parent SAI will no longer be divided by the number of children in college. So what has typically happened is that, say, I had one year when both my kids were in college, and so our SAI or EFC at that time was divided in two. So it was, that was a favorable thing to happen. It meant that the kids were eligible for more aid that year than any other, to be honest with you. But that is no longer going to be the case. The question will remain on the FAFSA, though. So when you're filing the FAFSA or you're working with people who are, and you see that that question is on the FAFSA, that is going to be the case. Now, why it stayed on the FAFSA, I think it was required to still be on there. It cannot be used, so you can't just simply divide the SAI by the number in college when determining federal aid eligibility. For the main state grant, that will not be taken into account, and schools will not automatically divide the SAI by the number in college when awarding their own institutional aid. None of that will happen automatically. That being said, if we have families that are in a situation where paying for 2 kids in college is financially challenging, which I'm sure that it obviously is in many, many cases, then they can go to their college and request a special circumstance review, basically to do an appeal, to let them know that financially this is a challenge for them. The difference here, though, is they're going to have to make the case that it does have a financial impact. So, for example, let's just say that I had 2 kids in college and one was attending the community college. They were getting free tuition and fees. They were living at home. We really didn't have any significant out-of-pocket expenses. Then I'm going to have the school's not going to make an adjustment for that. So, yes, the school can take it into account, but what you're going to find is that it is going to be based on that individual's family's situation on a case-by-case basis. So even though the question is on the FAFSA, I don't want people to assume that this college is going to take any action based on there being 2 in college. The family is going to need to initiate a conversation with the school, request a special circumstance review, and provide additional documentation to the college in order for anything to happen. Okay. Next, let's talk about assets. So this is one of the things that's making me most happy this year when it comes to the way the FAFSA is working. We have always said that assets have very little impact on financial aid eligibility. It's the income that is the real driver of financial aid eligibility. But nonetheless, people often have had to list assets, and they've believed that assets have had an impact on financial aid eligibility even when they didn't. They didn't get enough aid. They thought it was because they had assets. And in reality, they just might not have gotten any more aid even though they had assets. So we often are trying to debunk the myth that assets have this significant impact on financial aid eligibility. So I was very happy to see when they created a scenario with this new FAFSA where many more people are exempt from having to provide asset information. It's always been the case that some people were, but it's a broader group of people now who are not required to provide asset information. So anyone who's receiving any federally means-tested benefits is exempt from providing assets on the FAFSA, both the student and the parent, okay? So anyone who's receiving any of these federally means-tested benefits is exempt from providing asset information, period. Additionally, if people, let's say, aren't receiving any federally means-tested benefits, but their income is less than $60,000, depending on their tax schedules that they have to file, they may also be eligible to have their assets be exempt on the FAFSA. These used to be an and statement. Now these are either or, okay? So you might be aware of the fact that this year, all public school students in Maine are receiving free and reduced lunch. And we have confirmed this. We have this in writing from the Department of Education. Every single high school senior, for example, should be indicating yes to the free and reduced lunch question, which means that every single public high school student here in Maine is going to be exempt from providing assets on the FAFSA this year, okay? And additionally, it's going to be if anyone in their family was receiving those benefits. So we might have students who are, let's say, juniors in college, but they might have a younger sibling. And if anyone in their family for either 22 or 23 received any of these means-tested benefits, that also means that they are exempt from providing assets. So certainly really, really good news for our high school seniors, but it may go into other populations as well, because it's if anyone in their family is receiving any federally means-tested benefits, and again, that means for 22 or 23, okay? So I think that we're going to see that the vast majority of our families here in Maine are not going to have to provide asset information. They're going to meet one of these criteria. And so that's really, really good news. We are one of 7 states that actually is providing free and reduced lunch. So I don't know that this question will stay on the FAFSA next year. I think the question about do you receive any federally means tested benefits will stay on the FAFSA. What I don't know is that the free and reduced lunch will be one of the checkoff boxes. So we want to kind of mentally plan for that this may be just a 1-year thing, but it's, I think, going to be a really, really positive thing for this year for these families that are filing the FAFSA. Okay, hold on. I just have a question that I'm reading. What about reporting 529s opened by the parents? I'm sorry if I missed that. It looks like the slide said grandparents, parents aren't aunts and uncles. Okay, so if parents own the 529, there's no change in the sense that if a parent owns a 529, it will be listed as a parent asset on the FAFSA, but with two huge caveats. That's assuming that assets are required. So again, if you've got a 529, but your student is attending public high school, then you're going to check yes to the free and reduced lunchbox, and you're not going to have to provide any assets this year. But let's just say that's not the case. You don't qualify for any of these exemptions, then the 529 would be listed as a parent asset on the FAFSA. Now, there's another change to this. If you did have to provide assets and you do have a 529, and let's say you have a 529 for multiple children, one of the things that's new with this FAFSA is you're only going to list the value of the 529 for the student for whom you're completing the FAFSA. So, and back in the day, I was completing the FAFSA, let's say for Alex, my oldest son, he had a 529 account. My younger son, Noah, had a 529 account. At that point in time, I had to list the total value of both 529 accounts. New with this FAFSA, you will only have to list the value for that student that you're completing the FAFSA for. So hopefully that's clear. If there are any questions about that, please let me know. And then the not quite as good news, but again, hopefully most people aren't going to have to provide assets this year. There are some things that have been exempt in the past that are no longer exempt. So the small family-owned business, fewer than 100 full-time employees, had been an exempt asset on the FAFSA. It will no longer be, again, if people are required to provide asset information. And the family farm is no longer an exempt asset either. The primary residence, though, is still excluded. So if someone, again, has to provide assets and they have a family farm, when they're determining the value, the net worth of their family farm, they are going to take out the value of their home if they are living, their home is on that particular property. So, I think we're going to feel that a little bit more next year than we're going to feel it this year. And then the last thing I wanted to mention before we talk about some questions is that because there is no untaxed income section, but they still wanted to capture child support received, it's actually in the assets section, which seems kind of bizarre, right? So in the past, on the untaxed income section, they asked if people receive child support, but that untaxed income section is completely gone now. But they still wanted to know about this. So what they did is they put child support received in the asset section. So what that means, though, is that means that if people are exempt from providing assets, they're also going to be exempt from having to provide child support information for this year. Okay, so just kind of keep that in mind. If they're required to provide child support information, then what I want you to know is that it will be the child support that was received in the last completed calendar year. So given that the FAFSA is going to come out, at the very, very end of the year, probably most people when they're filing the FAFSA, the last completed year would be 2023. So we're using income from 2022. But if there is child support and people have to provide assets, if they do, and they have to provide that child support information, if they're filing after January 1st, they're going to provide the child support received in 2023. Okay, I know, clear as mud, but hopefully it does make sense. And let me know if it does not. No, I have a question here about the value of the family's business or farm on the 1040. No, it's not. That's another whole conversation about how to calculate that. So again, I think we will find that most families don't have to deal with that this year, but next year we will have more conversations about determining the value of businesses and farms. So thanks for that question. All right, so we are going to take, I'm going to take a couple of minutes and go through some questions and answers. I'm going to make sure we save time for Kahoot though, so we might skip a few of these questions, but let's see how many we can get through. So these are questions that I've heard, and I thought they were really important ones that I wanted to share the answers to with you. So can Pell Grant eligibility be determined before a student files a FAFSA? Yes. And so this is one of the primary reasons why they went ahead with the FAFSA Simplification Act and why they wanted to do an overhaul of the FAFSA is because they wanted the Pell Grant to be expanded, eligibility to be expanded, but also to be more transparent. So what they're doing is the poverty tables can be used to determine eligibility for a maximum Pell and a minimum Pell. So what that means is today we can go and we can look at the poverty tables for 2022, and based on a family's status, meaning whether or not the parent is a single parent, a parent, or a married parent, and the number of people in their household, you can actually see whether a student is eligible for a minimum Pell or a maximum Pell. So that can be determined today for those families. Eligibility is based again on the poverty table, and it ranges from individuals who have are at 175% of poverty up to 400% of poverty. So it's really, really been expanded. At the very end, I'm going to show you where you can find those tables. We do have them on our website, or a link to them on our website. So I'm going to show you that in a moment. Can the FAFSA be started and completing if the FSA ID has not been authenticated by the Social Security Administration? The answer to this is yes. And so I alluded to it back in a few moments ago when we were starting the presentation. So this is a yes, but. So it is possible that someone could create their FSA ID and immediately start the FAFSA and even submit it. So again, that was a new tidbit to us recently. However, the best case scenario is still for an individual to get their FSA ID ahead of time so that it can be authenticated. First of all, we want to be sure that it does get authenticated, that the information is all correct. We want to be sure that the information in the FSA ID is accurate before the FAFSA is started. So that's one piece to keep in mind. If someone decides to go ahead, though, what they're going to find is they're going to have to enter all of the information manually. So one of the real benefits of this new FAFSA is that all of the income information for those, for virtually everybody is going to come directly from the IRS. If they haven't been authenticated yet, that can't happen. So they're going to have to manually enter all of that information. What will happen is once their FSA ID has been authenticated, then it will go back and it will grab information from the IRS and overlay that on top of the information that they provided. Okay, so it will ultimately end up using the IRS information. It's just in the meantime, they will have gone through the hassle of having to enter all of that information manually. So the discussion we're having in-house is, would we recommend that people go ahead and start a FAFSA if their FSA ID hasn't been authenticated? I think it really depends. Best case scenario is I want them to get it ahead of time, have it authenticated. We're going to know the information is correct, and it's going to make filing the FAFSA so much easier. Okay, so that's what I want. But if I've got someone at a FAFSA session who hasn't done anything, and I'm afraid they will never complete this unless they do it tonight, I might say, let's go ahead and let's just manually enter all of the information, because I know it's going to be overlaid typically with the correct IRS information. So that's a discussion that we're having, and we will continue to have. So we're here and available to have that conversation with any of you, and I expect that we'll be sharing more information on that as time goes on. Let's see. So let me go on and answer a couple more questions and then see where we're at with other questions. So, can parents without a Social Security number get an FSA ID? Yes, they can once the 24-25 FAFSA is ruled out. So there is a new process that is available, and it will be very similar to people who have an SSN when they create an FSA ID. So these individuals without an SSN will still go to studentaid.gov. They'll still click on create account. It's going to seem very similar, although they will indicate that they don't have a Social Security number. And then when they get to the end, they will have one additional step that they will need to complete so that their identity can be verified. So I wanted to share this mainly because I want people to know, if they haven't heard, that this is going to be a process that is possible, that this will, again, will happen with the rollout of the 24-25 FAFSA. And if you're looking for details as to what that process is, we did discuss that in our Wednesday webinar this week. So that has been posted to our website. It is available on YouTube as well. So you can check that out. And we also did go into detail on this in the November FAFSA Friday. So you can find details in either of those presentations. All right, I'm going to do one more, and then we're going to play Kahoot. What happens if a student provides incorrect parent information when inviting their parent on the FAFSA? What does the student need to do to correct this mistake? So we have not gone into this specifically today, but in our other presentations we have. So we really do encourage you to go back if you haven't seen us talk about roles, the fact that the FAFSA has become a roles-based form. What that means is there's a parent section and a student section, but these two sections have to get connected. So how they get connected is whoever starts the FAFSA, and it can be either the student or the parent, they are going to have to provide identifying information for the other individual. So let's just say the student starts the FAFSA, they're going to have to put in the parent's name, date of birth, social security number, and email address. So let's just say they do that. An email gets sent to the parent. They get an email saying that they've been invited. They either click on the link in the email or they go directly to studentaid.gov. They go to log in. If their information was wrong, if it doesn't match what was in their FSA ID, or if they haven't created an FSA ID yet, there is going to be no student section of the FAFSA to link to. Okay, so in working with students and families, if someone says, I invited my parent, and the parent says, I got an email, but there's no FAFSA that I can link to, then that likely means that there was a mistake in the information that was used when inviting the parent. So something was wrong. So what the student needs to do is to go back into their section of the FAFSA, log in with their FSA ID, navigate to that invitation page and double check that information and correct it if it was wrong. Okay, so we are, I think, leaning much more towards having the parent start the FAFSA because the parent is much more likely to know the student's information, specifically the social security number. Either one can do it, but again, we need for that to be correct, because if it is not correct, then we're going to have issues, with being able to connect that information. And the student has to provide something in order to continue. So what we prefer they do is just, if they don't know the information for sure, stop, get the correct information, put it in, and then they can continue on with their FAFSA. Okay. Now, one of the questions I received ahead of time had to do with what's the most concerning part or challenging part of this new FAFSA. And I think one of the things that I would say is that students and parents are going to have to they're really going to have to work together on this. No longer is it possible, like it was, I'm going to be honest, with me and my kids, for me just to go in and do a FAFSA for someone, even if I have their FSA ID. And that's because there's two-factor authentication every time an FSA ID is used. So coordination, not only to access the FAFSA, but coordination to provide the correct information for the other party, I think is where the biggest challenge is going to be when it comes to the FAFSA. So we'll see how things go as we progress through. But those are some things that I'm thinking about that we're going to want to talk about as we talk with students and families. Okay. So I would like to now, I'm going to skip a couple of questions. And actually what I will do is I will address some of them if people want to stay on longer. But they are just questions that are not, that we're going to talk about them lots of times going forward. But what I would like to do is I want to end at least this segment by playing Kahoot, because I think people really enjoy it. And it's a good way to cement that information in our heads. Okay, so I am going to go over to Kahoot. And I've got it all open here. So let me just get to it and then I will do a screen share. So if you want to start logging in, 1 second, starting up here. Go to www.kahoot.it. All right, I'm going to share my screen. We're getting there. I have it all open and ready to go, but it still always seems like it takes a second for it to load. So, but it is loading now. Very slowly, I might add. All right, it's not loading at all. Okay, there we go. Thank goodness. Okay, so if you are at www.kahoot.it, you hold on 1 second, and there you go. There is the game pin. 862-4318. I would love to have as many of you as possible play along. I think you will, I hope you'll find it really enjoyable. And it's very competitive. It's not about winning, but I know that people want to win. And I even had a past winner come up to me recently, who was one of my coworkers, and just made sure that I knew that they had won the other day. So there's no doubt that people really, really like winning. Okay, so we've got 12 and a few more. Yes, the final FAFSA Friday. All right, at least for now. Maybe we will continue them on. All right, I think I'm gonna go ahead and get started. Okay, and one more. All right, here we go. Let's launch it. And for those of you who have played Kahoot before, you know that it's both about getting the right answer and getting the answer as quickly as possible, but just be sure you read the question because some of them are a little tricky. So let's start with a true and false. The FAFSA must be submitted if the parent, the FAFSA can be submitted. So sorry, the FAFSA can be submitted if the parent has not yet, parent's FSA ID has not yet been authenticated. Wow, I struggled on that one, didn't I? So true. The FAFSA can be submitted if the parent's FSA ID has not yet been authenticated, but we are not recommending that because they're going to have to enter all of the information manually. So, final FAFSA. I think this person has been to several sessions, maybe. Although we had just talked about this. Is it a good idea to start the FAFSA if the FSA ID has not been authenticated? Yes, no, or it depends. Yes, no, or it depends. And the answer in my mind is it depends. If I think that I'm only going to have one shot at that family, and if we don't get that FAFSA submitted that evening, then I'm probably going to go ahead and say, let's go ahead, even though it's not been authenticated. Okay. I much prefer that it get authenticated ahead of time, and so that we don't have to make that decision. But I think when push comes to shove, I'm going to have to say it depends on the family dynamic and everything that's going on, because at the end of the day, the thing I want to be sure of is that that FAFSA does get submitted. So that was kind of a tricky question there. All right, next question. When can a parent without an SSN create an FSA ID without an SSN? Now, when the FAFSA for 24-25 is released, 1 week after the 24-25 FAFSA is released, or in early February. When can a parent without a Social Security number create an FSA ID? And the answer is when the 24-25 FAFSA is released, okay? So that process will be available, but not until the FAFSA is released. So they cannot do that now. So, ooh, we've got a little bit of movement here. Okay. Sarah's on it. She's on fire. If a student files their FAFSA and then wants to add another school, when will they be able to do so? Immediately after submitting their FAFSA, 2 to 3 days after their FAFSA has been submitted, in early February, or never, sorry, one shot at it and you're done. What do you think the answer is? It is early February. Absolutely correct. Everyone got that one. That's great. So normally it would be within 2 to 3 days after their FAFSA has been submitted. And once they start processing FAFSA sometime later in January, it will go back to that. But for the early adopters, the people who file their FAFSAs in January, it won't be until early February. All right. Oh, now we've got Hannah coming on up. Okay, four in a row, Hannah. Great job. Who is always a contributor on the FAFSA? Is the contributor a person that's helping the student pay for college? Is it both of the student's parents? Is it a third party entity helping the family with the FAFSA? Or is it anyone who is required to provide consent for FTI exchange on the FAFSA? And the answer is anyone that is required to provide consent and approval on the FAFSA is considered a contributor. When parents are married, in some cases it's only one parent, in other cases it is two. But a contributor is not someone that has to, being a contributor does not mean that someone has to pay for college. So we really want to be clear about that fact as well. All right, I love this. This is some back and forth going on here. All right, let's tackle this next question. When parents are divorced, which parent is the parent on the FAFSA? Is it the parent the student has lived with most the last 12 months? Is it the parent who's willing to file the FAFSA? Is it the parent who provided the most financial support in the last 12 months? Or both biological parents, even if the parents are divorced? Which parent is the parent on the FAFSA? Yes, it is the parent who provided the most financial support in the last 12 months. Absolutely correct. Both biological parents do not have to provide information on the FAFSA if they are divorced. The student needs to identify which parent provided the most financial support, and that will be the parent on the FAFSA. Of course, the CSS profile, which we've not talked about at all today, is different. All right, Sarah, in the lead. Let's continue on. This is a true or false. The 24-25 FAFSA will be using 2023 income information. Is that true or is that false? And the answer is, it is false. It's kind of tricky, right? It's actually 2022 income information that's being used on the 24-25 FAFSA. All righty, no change in the board there. So let's see, what about this one? Parents who do not file taxes don't have to provide consent and approval. Is that true or is that false? Parents who don't file taxes don't have to provide consent and approval. True or false? And the answer is false. Everyone has to provide consent and approval. Everyone, absolutely everyone. Otherwise, the student will be ineligible for federal financial aid. Okay, we're on question number 9. Students must report their income on the FAFSA even if they don't file taxes. So this is one of the questions I did not get to. So let's see how this one goes because we did not talk about this today. Okay, we have a split right down the middle, and we had some people who didn't even, I think, try to answer this one. So here's the way that it's going to work. If a student didn't file taxes, they do have to provide consent and approval. They will get information that will come back from the IRS that will show that there is no tax record on file. But these students will not have to enter any wage information on the FAFSA. That's different than in the past. They will not have to provide any wage information on the FAFSA. They are simply considered to be non-tax filers. However, if they're selected for verification, not saying that they will be, but if they are, at that point, they will have to provide wage information in the form of like W-2s, for example, to their school so that their school can determine whether or not they should have filed taxes. So this came up in the Wednesday webinar the other day. This is something that, I just really realized I didn't think they would have to provide any wage information if they were selected for verification because there's no wages listed on the FAFSA, but they do, but for a different purpose, to help the financial aid office determine whether or not they should have filed taxes. All right, so that one was a tough one. The number in college question on the FAFSA will always be used to determine eligibility for federal aid. It will always be used to determine eligibility for the school's financial aid. It will always be used to determine eligibility for the Maine State grant, or it isn't used automatically to determine financial aid eligibility. Which is the correct answer? The correct answer is that it isn't automatically used to determine financial aid eligibility, okay? Schools can use it to determine whether a professional's, a special circumstance adjustment should be made, and that might result in more financial aid eligibility, but it's done on a case-by-case basis, not done automatically, and the student and the family need to reach out to the school. Okay, continuing on. Question 11, child support received, if required, because it's not required if assets aren't required, is listed for which year? Is it the 22 calendar year, the 23 calendar year, the estimated for 24, the estimated child support going to be received in 24, or the most recently completed calendar year? And the answer is the most recently completed calendar year. So even though income is coming from 22, child support is kind of, being treated differently, and it will come from the most recently completed calendar year. All right, so here we go. This last question. Every student receiving free or reduced lunch will be exempt from providing assets. Is that true or is that false? Is that true or is that false? And the answer is, that is true. Every student receiving free or reduced lunch should be checking yes to the question about that, and that will result in them being exempt from providing assets. Now, one little piece I just want to mention here is that question is in the parent section. Let's say the student starts their section of the FAFSA first. If the parent hasn't provided any information yet, the student will see the asset questions because the parent won't have done their section. If the parent does their section first and says yes to that, then the student won't see those questions at all, okay? Because it's both the parent and student that are going to be exempt. But if the parent hasn't started the FAFSA yet, the FAFSA won't know the answer to that question. If the student has provided asset information, because again, they started the FAFSA and the parent hasn't answered that question yet, it will still be excluded from the formula. So even if they list them, it will be exempt from the formula. All right. Let's see where we landed today. And I know we're over time, and if you need to leave us, I totally understand. NCAN's been doing 2-hour sessions, and I think we probably needed to as well on some of these. All right, Hannah. There you go, Hannah. Congratulations, Hannah. Really great job. Great job, everyone. I am so excited that you were here and participating in this. Now, what I will do, if anyone who wants to stay on, and again, I know people might need to go, but I am going to look at the questions in the chat and address any questions that you asked that I hadn't gotten to yet, okay? So just give me a second to review them. Have the percentages of student parent income and assets under consideration changed from previous years? The formula has changed. You're going to see more that it's changed on the income side because what they call the asset protection allowance has been updated. The income protection allowance has been updated. Asset rate is still very similar, 20% for students if assets are listed, and up to no more than 5.64% for parents. So the next question, family size on the 24-25 FAFSA follows the IRS definition for dependents, correct? So if a family provides more than half of someone's support, but that person doesn't live under their roof, they can't count them as part of the family size on the FAFSA. So what is going to happen is the family size is going to come back as part of the FTI. So it is going to be calculated based on tax filing status. So married filing with 2 dependents, for example, would be a family size of 4. If that is incorrect, that is an updatable field. So for example, if someone had a situation where students were claimed alternate years by parents, and the parent on the FAFSA had not claimed that student, they could update that information. So it is updatable. Randy, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the definition of who is considered a dependent in as defined on the FAFSA into the email that I'll do as a follow-up. Okay, does that sound fair enough? Okay, so question here. Are you advising families to request a professional judgment since the Department of Ed didn't update income protection allowances to reflect the inflation levels? Okay, so this is going a little bit into the weeds, but what's going on is it has recently been announced that the tables have not been updated. There's this income protection allowance, which protects a portion of people's income, um, and that table has not been updated to reflect inflation. So my understanding is that there are a couple of scenarios. It is not a decision that it won't be updated. So one scenario is that FAFSAs aren't being processed initially in January, as we've talked about today. So they could go in and make the updates to the tables before they process the first batch of FAFSAs. So it may be that it is updated. Secondly, they could not update it and they could just say it is what it is for this year. A third option is they could get FAFSAs processed, but once they've been processed, then reprocess them once they've gone in and updated the tables. So we don't know what they're going to do. So I would just say to hold tight for now and to see where that all lands. I will say we've been using the financial aid estimator, and SAIs are much lower than they were last year, even without this adjustment for inflation. So people might be very pleasantly surprised what their SAI is, despite the fact that that table has not been updated yet. Okay, I heard that students can't make changes to their FAFSA until the end of January. If they make a mistake when inviting their parents, are they going to have to wait until they can make changes in late January to log back in and re-invite their parent? That is an absolutely fabulous question. Because what's going to happen is they can't even submit their FAFSA unless they go back and make that fix. So it's not actually a correction. And I'm going to say this multiple times, and I already have said it multiple times. My understanding is that that the parent won't be able to link to the student's FAFSA, but the student will need parent information on the FAFSA. So what the student is going to have to do is go back in before the FAFSA can be submitted, re-invite the parent by correcting that information, and then the parent will be able to link to the student's FAFSA by going back to studentaid.gov and clicking on a link, and then they can finish off the FAFSA and submit it. So if they make a mistake, it's not dealt with through the corrections process. It's actually dealt with before the FAFSA is even submitted. Okay, hope that makes sense. I'm so anxious to see how this actually works. We have not obviously seen a live FAFSA. Oh yeah, the relationship between the student and parents is going to be interesting. I think for multiple years, federal student aid, has always said it's the student who's the applicant. That is absolutely correct. Just like for the admissions process, for the financial aid process, the student is indeed the applicant. But most of the students that are under the age of 24 need to provide parent information on the FAFSA. But basically, they have also said that the student should fill their role and the parents should fill their role. And by what they're doing with the FSA IDs and the two-factor authentication, they're really forcing that to be the case, that parents can't just do it on the student's behalf and vice versa. There is a scenario where parents can do a bit more, which we have not gone into yet. We haven't seen it worked, yet. So we will share more of that when the FAFSA comes out. But yeah, I think this coordination is going to be a challenge for some families. It won't be an issue for all families, but for some families, it absolutely will. All right, so I want to do one more thing. That was the end of the questions. So I want to go back to the presentation for a moment, and just for those of you who are still here, and there are some of you, so I'm so glad you're still here and able to be. I understand people are so busy. I want to go on and just share this resource with you. So I wanted to let you know that we have a FAFSA simplification page that we've had out there for quite some time now, but I want you to check it out when you have a chance, if you would, because we have some new information there. So we do have a bunch of recorded sessions as well as slide decks. This one will be there sometime early next week. But October's FAFSA Friday focused on Pell Grants and pathways for students who have challenging situations. We did not touch on much of any of that today. If you haven't heard that one, I would love to have you check that out. November's FAFSA Friday, I see a typo there, is focused on FAFSA creation for those without an SSN. So again, you can go back to that and check that out if you're interested. What we've added are some new tools. So if you want to walk through the FAFSA, at least a couple of the scenarios of the FAFSA, you can use the FAFSA prototype. That is available now, and it will give you a feel of what the FAFSA is going to feel like to navigate. There will be no FAFSA demo this year. They made that announcement a few weeks ago that there is no FAFSA demo. What we're going to get this year only is the FAFSA prototype, but it is helpful. Those Pell lookup tables that I was mentioning, you can click on that link and you can see the tables that you could use to work with students and help them identify whether or not they might be eligible for a maximum Pell or a minimum Pell even before they file the FAFSA. And then we have some resources that we've had out there for a bit, our 10 important changes to the FAFSA handout, our glossary of terms, and some case studies. So that is what I wanted to share. And then last but not least, January's Wednesday webinar will be filing the 24-25 FAFSA. We are going to expand this session to an hour and a half because there's no way we'll be able to get through it in an hour. The goal of this session is to actually walk through the FAFSA. So we will either do that live, but probably what we're going to do is based it on live screenshots. So yeah, we'll probably be taking screenshots so we can show you a variety of scenarios that we have not seen yet. There are many pieces that we have not seen. For a matter of fact, we haven't seen, for example, if someone has to enter income information manually, we haven't seen what that looks like yet. So we will have that in the Wednesday webinar in January. So you can register for that now if you would like, and I hope that you will join us for that. Whew. Thank goodness it's Friday, everyone. Anything more before I close down this session? Well, I'm going to stop recording.